"You won't be able to feed your children with this currency," declared the governor of the French central bank, Ibrahim Traoré, smiled as he held up the new banknotes. "On the contrary, with this money, our children will finally see the true value of their own wealth." The day the gold-backed Sankara Franc entered circulation marked not just a currency change, but the end of 60 years of economic colonialism. The conference room in the presidential palace of Burkina Faso was unusually crowded that morning. Ibrahim Traoré had summoned his economic advisors, cabinet ministers, and central bank officials for what he described only as a matter of national sovereignty. The atmosphere was tense with anticipation. At precisely 900 a.m. Traoré entered, carrying a simple folder embossed with the national emblem, rather than taking his customary seat at the head of the table. He remained standing, his expression reflecting the gravity of what he was about to propose. "For 64 years since our so-called independence," he began, "Burkina Faso has never truly controlled its own money. The CFA franc, designed by France in 1945 for its colonies, remains our currency today. A currency. We don't print ourselves a currency whose monetary policy is decided in Paris, not Ouagadougou." He opened the folder and laid out a series of documents on the table. "We are required to keep 50% of our foreign exchange reserves in the French Treasury. We must maintain a fixed exchange rate with the euro. Our central bank has limited freedom to set interest rates or manage inflation." His voice remained measured but carried unmistakable conviction. "This is not the arrangement of independent nations. This is economic colonialism by another name, finance." Minister Kabor, a respected economist, educated at the Sorbonne, raised his hand tentatively. "Mr. President, while I don't disagree with your assessment, the CFA arrangement also provides stability, predictable exchange rates for trade, and low inflation. Changing this system would create significant risks." Traoré nodded, acknowledging the point. "Indeed, that's the bargain we've been offered: surrender economic sovereignty in exchange for stability. But I ask you this: has this stability delivered prosperity? For our people have 6 decades of this arrangement lifted Burkina Faso from poverty?" The silence that followed was answer enough. Despite possessing significant gold reserves and other natural resources, Burkina Faso remained one of the world's poorest nations today. Traoré continued, "I am proposing what some will call radical, but what I consider long overdue. Burkina Faso will introduce its own sovereign currency, the Sankara Franc, named in honor of our revolutionary leader who first dared to imagine true independence." The room erupted in murmurs as central bank governor Ouagadougou looked particularly concerned. "Mr. President, creating a new currency requires immense preparation. We would need adequate reserves, international recognition, robust institutions, all true." Traoré interrupted, "which is why this will not happen overnight. I propose a 2-year transition plan." He gestured to the documents before him. "Phase 1, build our gold reserves by nationalizing mining operations and requiring all gold produced in Burkina Faso to be sold first to the national treasury. Phase 2, establish an independent monetary authority. Phase 3, print our own currency backed by physical gold reserves." Economic planning director Sankara, no relation to the revolutionary leader, raised the question everyone was thinking: and what will be France's response? "The CFA arrangement is bound by international agreements. They will not simply allow us to walk away." Traoré's expression hardened slightly. "I anticipate significant resistance, both diplomatic and economic. France benefits enormously from the CFA system controlling the monetary policy of 14 African nations, having preferential access to our resources, receiving billions in seigniorage profits. They will not surrender these privileges willingly." For the next 3 hours, the meeting delved into technical details, potential obstacles, and strategic approaches. By its conclusion, despite lingering concerns, a consensus had formed around a critical point: monetary sovereignty was essential for true independence, whatever the challenges. As the officials filed out, Traoré asked Central Bank Governor Ouagadougou to remain behind when they were alone. Traoré spoke more candidly. you have reservations. Governor, I need to hear them honestly. Odogo sighed deeply, Mr. President. I believe in the vision, but the international financial system can be merciless to African nations that challenge its rules. They can restrict access to SWIFT banking systems, downgrade our credit rating, block international loans, trigger capital flight. He paused. They have tools to create the very instability that would prove we need their oversight. Traoré listened thoughtfully. And if we proceed, despite these risks, then we must be prepared for economic warfare, Ouedraogo replied simply. And we must have contingency plans for every potential attack. In the months that followed, preparations began in utmost secrecy. A special committee of economists, legal experts, and security officials worked to design not just a new currency, but a comprehensive strategy to protect Burkina Faso's economy during the transition. The first public hint of what was coming occurred 11 months later, when Traoré announced the renegotiation of all foreign mining contracts under the new terms. At least 51% of ownership would transfer to the Burkina state, and 25% of all gold produced would be sold directly to the national treasury at market rates. International reaction was swift and predictable. Mining companies threatened to withdraw operations. The IMF issued warnings about investment climate deterioration. French media described the move as resource nationalism that would damage Burkina Faso's economy. Traoré addressed these criticisms directly in a national broadcast. For decades, foreign companies have extracted our gold while our people remained in poverty. No longer the wealth beneath our soil belongs first to the people of Burkina Faso. Fair partnerships are welcome, but exploitation is finished. Behind the scenes phase 2 was already underway. A team of monetary experts, some quietly recruited from other African nations and even sympathetic European economists, began designing the institutional framework for currency independence. Printing facilities were discreetly established. Security features were developed. Most importantly, physical gold reserves began to accumulate in a newly constructed, heavily guarded vault beneath the central bank. News of these preparations inevitably leaked. 14 months after the initial meeting, the Financial Times published a speculative article titled, "Is Burkina Faso Planning CFA Exit?" The piece quoted anonymous sources claiming Traoré was preparing to withdraw from the West African Monetary Union. The French response came within days. Finance Minister Jean-Pierre Allaire requested an emergency meeting with Traoré in the presidential palace. Their exchange was tense, but revealing President Traoré LLA began I must express France's deep concern about rumors regarding Burkina Faso's monetary intentions. The CFA arrangement has served the region well for generations. Any unilateral withdrawal create regional instability and harm your own citizens. Traoré listened politely before responding. Minister Allaire would France allow another nation to hold 50% of its reserves, print its money, and control its monetary policy? That's not a fair comparison. It is precisely the fair comparison. Traoré interrupted firmly. What you call stability we increasingly see as control. Burkina Faso respects its international obligations, but our monetary sovereignty is not negotiable. Shifted tactics. Perhaps there is room for reform within the existing framework. France is open to discussing reduced reserve requirements or greater representation in monetary decisions. Too little, too late. Traoré replied. For decades, African nations have requested exactly these reforms, only to be ignored or given token adjustments. The time for half measures has passed. As the meeting concluded, without resolution, delivered what sounded like both a warning and a threat. President Traoré, I must caution that currency independence without adequate preparation could lead to hyperinflation, capital flight, and economic collapse. France would be unable to provide assistance in such a scenario. Traoré's response was calm but definitive. We are well aware of the risks, Minister. We are equally aware that every nation that has achieved prosperity has done so by controlling its money. 2 days after this meeting, the economic pressure began. International credit rating agencies downgraded Burkina Faso's sovereign debt. Several French banks suspended correspondent relationships with Burkina financial institutions complicating international transactions. Rumors of impending currency devaluation triggered runs on banks as some wealthy citizens attempted to convert CFA francs to euros or dollars. It was time to accelerate the plan. 18 months after the initial strategy meeting, 6 months ahead of the original schedule, Traoré addressed the nation in a historic broadcast. Citizens of Burkina Faso, he began today. I announce a step that many said was impossible on July 15th, exactly 1 month from today. Burkina Faso will introduce its own sovereign currency, the Sankara Franc. The announcement included several key details designed to prevent panic. The new currency would initially circulate alongside the CFA for a 6-month transition period. It would be fully backed by gold reserves, with each note redeemable for its equivalent in gold at the central bank if desired. Most importantly, the Sankara Franc would launch with a fixed exchange rate of 1-to-1 with the CFA to ensure price stability. During the transition, this is not merely a change of paper money, Traoré explained. This is Burkina Faso reclaiming a fundamental right of any truly independent nation, the right to control its own monetary destiny. International reaction was immediate and largely negative. The governor of the French central bank, Michel Dupont, gave a dismissive interview to Radio France International. This so-called sovereign currency is a political stunt that ignores economic realities. You cannot simply declare monetary independence without the structures to support it. Mark my words, Burkina won't be able to feed their children with this currency. When these comments were relayed to Traoré during a press conference, his response became instantly iconic. Holding up a prototype of the new banknote, which featured Thomas Sankara on one side and Burkina Faso gold miners on the other, he smiled and said, "On the contrary, with this money, our children will finally see the true value of their own wealth." As the launch date approached, both excitement and anxiety spread through Burkina Faso. Government officials conducted educational campaigns in markets, schools, and village gatherings explaining the transition process and addressing concerns. Banks prepared for the massive logistical challenge of handling two currencies simultaneously. Security forces increased vigilance against potential economic sabotage. On July 10th, just 5 days before the scheduled currency launch, a major test of Burkina Faso's resolve arrived. The IMF announced it was suspending a previously approved $150 million loan facility due to concerning monetary policy developments. Simultaneously, several international banks froze correspondent relationships with Burkina Faso's financial system, effectively cutting it off from global financial networks. The economic team had anticipated these moves months earlier. They had established alternative banking channels through friendly nations, including Ghana, Algeria, Russia, and China, that were willing to maintain financial relationships outside Western-controlled systems. Currency swap arrangements ensured that essential imports, like medicine and fuel, could continue flowing. More surprisingly, several neighboring countries within the CFA zone privately expressed support for Burkina Faso's monetary independence, with some indicating they might follow a similar path if the transition proved successful. July 15th arrived with a mixture of ceremony and tension. In Ouagadougou's Independence Square, thousands gathered to witness the first official transaction using the Sankara Franc. Tier himself purchased a basket of locally grown produce from a market woman, paying with crisp new bills that featured not European monuments but Burkinabe historical figures and landmarks. Today, our money represents our values, our resources, our sovereignty. Traoré declared to the cheering crowd. For the first time since colonial rule, we decide our monetary policy based on the needs of Burkinabe citizens, not the interests of former colonial powers. In the weeks that followed, the practical challenges of currency transition became apparent. Some merchants initially hesitated to accept the new money. Rural areas experienced delays in currency distribution. International businesses demanded premiums to accept Sankara francs for transactions, yet the catastrophic scenarios predicted by Western economists failed to materialize. Inflation remained. Moderate bank runs subsided as citizens gained confidence in the gold backing. Most importantly, the psychological impact of monetary sovereignty created a wave of economic nationalism that boosted local production and reduced import dependency. 3 months into the transition, Burkina Faso faced its first major monetary policy test. A drought affecting agricultural regions threatened food security and price stability. Under the CFA system, the country would have had limited tools to address this crisis. Any significant monetary expansion would have required approval from the regional central bank dominated by French interests with the Sankara Franc. Burkina Faso's monetary authority was able to implement targeted liquidity measures to support affected farmers and stabilize food markets. The policy succeeded in preventing both food shortages and inflationary spirals, demonstrating the practical advantages of monetary sovereignty. 6 months after the launch, as the transition period concluded and the CFA was fully phased out, international observers began acknowledging the unexpected success of Burkina Faso's monetary experiment. Bloomberg published an analysis titled "Against All Odds: How Burkina Faso's Currency Gamble is Paying Off," noting that gold backing had provided crucial confidence during the transition period. Even more significant was the regional impact. Mali and Niger, neighboring countries with similar colonial monetary histories, sent official delegations to study Burkina Faso's approach. Discussions began about the possibility of a new regional currency, one controlled by African nations themselves rather than former colonial powers. 1 year after the Sankara Franc's introduction, Ibrahim Traoré addressed a special summit of West African leaders in Ouagadougou. The topic: monetary sovereignty for the entire region. What we have proven, Traoré told his fellow heads of state, is that the choice between sovereignty and stability is a false dichotomy. With proper planning, adequate reserves, and strong institutions, African nations can have both. We can control our own money while maintaining economic predictability. The French government, which had initially dismissed the Sankara Franc as doomed to fail, now adopted a different approach. French President Martel publicly offered a reformed partnership that would grant greater autonomy within a revamped CFA system. Traoré's response was diplomatic but firm. We appreciate France's willingness to discuss reforms that were impossible to achieve for 60 years until we took independent action. However, Burkina Faso will not return to any system where our monetary policy is decided outside our borders. We remain open to regional cooperation, but only on the basis of full sovereignty and equal partnership. The economic data told a compelling story. 18 months after the currency transition, Burkina Faso's economy was growing at 2% annually, faster than when it used the CFA. Inflation, contrary to dire predictions, stabilized at around 4%, comparable to many developed economies. Most significantly, poverty rates had begun to decline as monetary sovereignty enabled targeted development policies that had been impossible under the previous system. The gold backing of the currency, initially seen by some economists as an outdated approach, proved crucial to its success. Citizens who had never trusted paper money now embraced a currency they could, if necessary, convert to physical gold. This confidence allowed the central bank to gradually reduce the backing percentage as trust in the currency's institutional foundation strengthened. 2 years after the launch, Traoré invited international journalists to the national gold vault beneath the central bank. The unprecedented tour revealed neat stacks of gold bars, each stamped with the Burkina emblem, physical proof of the currency's foundation. This gold is not merely a reserve, Traoré explained to the assembled press. It represents a fundamental shift in how we view our resources. Under the previous system, our gold was extracted by foreign companies, sold on international markets with minimal benefit to our people. Now it serves as the foundation of our monetary sovereignty, connecting our natural wealth directly to our economic independence. The global financial establishment, which had initially condemned Burkina Faso's monetary experiment, began studying it as a potential model for resource-rich developing nations. Harvard economists published papers analyzing the Burkina model of resource-backed currency sovereignty. Even the IMF, in a carefully worded report, acknowledged that, under specific conditions, with adequate reserves, national currencies can provide policy flexibility benefits that outweigh integration advantages. Perhaps the most powerful validation came not from institutions, but from ordinary citizens. Aisha Odreo, a market vendor in Ouagadougou who had initially been skeptical of the new currency, summarized the transformation: before we used money that had no connection to us faces. We didn't recognize buildings we had never seen. Now, when I hold these notes with Sankara's face, with our own landmarks, I feel pride, and when I know it is backed by our own gold, I feel security. For Ibrahim Traoré, the Sankara Franc represented more than economic policy. It embodied a philosophy of self-determination that extended beyond monetary matters. In a reflective interview marking the currency's second anniversary, he explained this broader significance: monetary sovereignty is not merely a technical matter for economists and bankers. It is fundamentally about who controls a nation's destiny. When others control your money, they influence everything from education to healthcare, from infrastructure to industrial development. By reclaiming this basic right, we have opened possibilities previously closed to us. 3 years after its introduction, the Sankara Franc had become a symbol of African monetary independence that resonated far beyond Burkina Faso's borders. 5 other West African nations had begun similar transitions away from the CFA, creating the possibility of a truly African monetary zone based on mutual cooperation rather than post-colonial dependency. The French government, recognizing the shifting reality, announced the modernization of its relationship with remaining CFA countries, reducing reserve requirements and increasing African representation in monetary decision-making. These reforms, inconceivable before Burkina Faso's bold move, came too late to reverse the momentum toward monetary sovereignty across the region. For years after that tense initial meeting in the presidential palace, Traoré again gathered his economic team, this time for a very different purpose: to celebrate the Sankara Franc success and plan its future development. The currency that many international experts had predicted would collapse within months had not only survived but thrived, enabling economic policies tailored to Burkina needs rather than external interests. The next phase, Traoré explained to his team, is to move beyond sovereignty to prosperity. Having proven we can manage our own money responsibly, we must now use this tool to build the inclusive development that has eluded us for generations. This meant using monetary policy to support strategic sectors: agriculture, renewable energy technology, education, while maintaining the discipline that had ensured the currency's stability. It meant gradually reducing gold backing as institutional trust strengthened, freeing those resources for productive investment. Most ambitiously, it meant working with neighboring countries to build a regional monetary system based on mutual benefit rather than external control. 5 years after its introduction, the Sankara Franc had become a case study in economic sovereignty. International finance textbooks now included chapters on Burkina Faso's approach to monetary independence. African economic students analyzed the transition strategies that had overcome international opposition. Even some European economists acknowledged that the CFA system was increasingly untenable in a world where former colonies demanded genuine independence for ordinary Burkina-Faso citizens. The currency had become a source of national pride. The image of Thomas Sankara on the notes connected present policies to the revolutionary leader's vision of true independence. The gold backing provided tangible security in a region where financial uncertainty had long been the norm. Most importantly, the ability to shape monetary policy around national priorities rather than external demands had created new possibilities for addressing long-standing challenges. Ibrahim True reflecting on the journey during a currency exhibition marking the 5th anniversary offered perhaps the most succinct assessment. Money is nothing more than a tool. What matters is who controls the tool and what purpose it serves. Our currency now serves our people, our development, our future. This is the essence of true independence. The story of the Sankara Franc had become more than a chapter in Burkina Faso's history. It had become a powerful example of how Rasarake African nations could transform their relationship with the global financial system using their natural wealth, not just to back currencies, but to back their own independent development paths. As other African nations began following Burkina Faso's model, adapting it to their own circumstances and resources, a new pattern of economic sovereignty was emerging across the continent, a pattern that challenged centuries of external control and opened possibilities for genuine self-determination. The prediction made by the French central bank governor that Burkina Fasos would not be able to feed their children with the new currency had proven not just wrong, but opposite to reality. With monetary sovereignty, Burkina Faso had gained the policy tools to address food security, education, healthcare, and infrastructure in ways that had been impossible under external monetary control. The Sankara Franc represented more than economic independence. It embodied a fundamental truth that Traoré had expressed from the beginning. True sovereignty required control over fundamental systems, especially money. By reclaiming this basic right, Burkina Faso had changed not just its currency, but its future.